Top 10 serial killers of all time. There have been plenty of serial killers recorded in the whole of history, many of whom had murdered a high number of people, left their signatures at crime scenes. But some serial killers have stood out in history over other serial killers. These killers have done the unthinkable, have committed the worst crimes against humanity. Serial killers are very dangerous breeds of humans. Some of the killers are more dangerous than others. From rape, murder to cannibalism, these 10 serial killers committed more crimes against humanity than the world has ever seen. Let's take a look at the top 10 serial killers of all time. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the United States and around the world. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he committed his first murder at the tender age of 18 in Ohio State in 1978. Jeffrey Dahmer committed the second murder in 1987. Onwards, he targeted mostly African-American homosexual males who he convinced to follow him to his apartment. Jeffrey had promised his victims sex and drugs, convincing them to sleep over in his apartment. On getting to his apartment, Jeffrey would murder his victims, dismember their bodies, mutilate the bodies, even going as far as eating some of the victims' remains. He stored some of the remains in his fridge, committed numerous forms of perversions on the victims' bodies. He would first drug his victims before murdering them. Jeffrey Dahmer lived a normal life and was never suspected, making his atrocities very unusual. Jeffrey's crimes were more of cannibalism and necrophilia, continuing to kill until his arrest in 1991. He was finally caught on the day one of his victims escaped from the apartment, getting the attention of the police, who followed the victim to the apartment. On getting to the apartment, police discovered acids used to dispose of his victims, including photographs of his victims. Records have it that he killed over 17 people within 14 years following his arrest. During trials, he confessed to drilling holes into his victims' heads, intending to turn them into sex slaves. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, with an extra year sentence added as a result of his first ever murder. In 1992, while in prison, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Ted Bundy. Born Theodore Robert Bundy on November 27, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, United States of America. You wouldn't talk about serial killers and not mention the name Ted Bundy. Who would have thought the very handsome, charming young man would be a serial killer? Ted Bundy killed many people for over a decade, to the surprise of many who never suspected him to be a serial killer. Raised by a teenage single mom alongside the grandmother, Ted Bundy attended the University of Washington, where he would graduate. After graduation, Bundy started to murder people, claiming his first ever victim in the year 1966, in Seattle, Washington. Bundy committed numerous murders of young women, sexually assaulting them within Washington. He murdered more women in the state of Utah, Colorado, before he was arrested. Ted Bundy escaped arrest and police custody after he was arrested and charged for kidnapping. He escaped police custody on numerous occasions in Colorado while on trials. Bundy murdered these young women between 1974 and 1978, with the total number of recorded deaths at 28. While in Florida, Bundy had raped his last victim, a 12-year-old girl, and murdered her. It proved to be his last killing before he was caught while driving a stolen vehicle a week after the murder. During trials, Bundy attracted media attention as his case became the first murder trial to be televised. He was something of a celebrity during his trials. Despite fighting for his life, he was convicted and spent 9 years on death row. He appealed his death sentence but was never granted his wish. Bundy was executed on January 24, 1989 by 7 a.m. local time at the Florida State Prison. Bundy was executed in an electric chair just outside the prison, with crowds of people witnessing his death, with many cheering on, with some setting off fireworks after Ted's execution. Jack the Ripper. Between August the 7th to September the 10th, 1888, 5 London female prostitutes were murdered around the Whitechapel district in London's East End. Jack the Ripper was the serial killer responsible for the killings, also known as the Whitechapel Murderer. Whitechapel district at the time was home to many skilled immigrants, with violence and crime were also high around the district. Prostitution was legal, except in cases where it had caused public disturbance was it termed illegal. Jack the Ripper took advantage. He would convince his victims to follow him to a dark corner of the street, where he would slit their throats, mutilating their bodies in a gruesome manner. The signature left by the killer on the crime scenes suggested he knew human anatomy, probably a surgeon. Each of the victims was killed within miles of each other. The police at the time sprang into action to solve the murder. Despite investigations carried out and many suspects, the culprit was never found. Around the period the killings were happening, an anonymous person sent a series of letters to the London Metropolitan Police Service at the time. The anonymous person claimed to be the serial killer responsible for the murder of the prostitutes, with the signature name on the letters being Jack the Ripper. The killings suddenly stopped, but the killer was never identified and remains anonymous to this day. Harold Shipman. In the year 1972, Harold Shipman killed the first of his victims, with records saying he killed as much as 71 patients, with the total number of his victims at 218. Shipman was a British physician who would murder most of his patients. Shipman made use of drugs with high levels of diamorphine to murder most of his victims. Shipman crimes were uncovered in 1988 by an undertaker and another doctor who had discovered a surprising number of cremation certificates Shipman had signed off on. Most of his victims were elderly women who were mostly seated and fully clothed before they were murdered. The investigation after the discovery wasn't handled properly, with Shipman killing 3 more patients. The same year, he was found guilty of the murder of a woman whose lawyer daughter, Kathleen Grundy, accused him of killing her mother. Kathleen accused Shipman of trying to create a fake will with himself as the sole beneficiary of the mum's wealth. An autopsy was carried out and it was revealed she had high levels of diamorphine in her body. Shipman was officially charged with 15 murders. In the year 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Shipman committed suicide while in prison, with him never admitting to any of the murders. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was one of the most notorious serial killers of the time. Gacy sexually abused and murdered more than 30 young boys between the early 70s and late 70s. John lived in the suburbs of Chicago, a professional clown at children's parties. No one ever suspected John to be a serial killer, as he participated in local politics, even hosting parties around the neighborhood. In the year of 1978, a 15-year-old schoolboy got missing and was last seen in the company of John Wayne Gacy. Police swung into action, having a search warrant. They arrived at Gacy's house. While searching his home, they discovered a class ring and clothing, which were properties of other young boys who had been missing. While searching the house, the police discovered the remains of 29 young boys under 4-foot crawl space beneath the house. According to reports at the time, Gacy's ex-wife had complained of the odor coming from beneath their home, with Gacy brushing it off as moisture-causing mildew. Many of the victims' family members had suspected Gacy earlier, with law enforcement agencies not taking their claims seriously. Law enforcement came in for criticism after the discovery. Apart from the total number of bodies discovered at his home, Gacy confessed to killing more young boys, disposing of their bodies into a nearby lake. Gacy tried claiming insanity during trials but failed. He was convicted on 33 counts of murder. In the year 1994, he was executed through lethal injection. H. Holmes. Holmes was an American pharmacist who had an early career as an insurance scammer. He moved to Illinois in 1893, around the period of the Chicago World's Fair, before establishing himself as a pharmacist. Around this period, Holmes built a 3-story inn, later known to be Murder Castle. Holmes converted the inn to a torture chamber where he would do all sorts of experiments and torture on his victims. Some of the rooms in the inn contained gas lines, hidden peepholes, trapdoors. Some other rooms contained passages, ladders, and hallways. Inside one of the rooms also contained a greased chute leading to the basement, where he had installed a surgical table alongside a furnace and medieval rack. Around the time of the World's Fair, Holmes lured his victims, which consisted mostly of young women. Holmes lured them to his inn, then asphyxiated them with poisoned gas, then proceeded to take them down to the basement, experimenting with their bodies. Holmes disposed of some of the victims' bodies into the furnace while selling skeletons and remains of some of the victims to medical schools. Holmes's killings and murders were uncovered when one of his collaborators informed the police after he had refused to pay the collaborator. Holmes was hanged in 1896 before his death. He admitted to murdering at least 27 people. Louis Garavito. Serial killers do murder people without remorse throughout history. There have been records of brutal killings by serial killers. Not sure any have killed more people than Louis Garavito. Louis Garavito was a Colombian serial killer and one of the most dangerous serial killers of all time. Known as the Beast, he was born on January 2nd, 1957, in Genova, Quindío, Colombia. Records have it that he killed at least 138 to 192 young boys, raping and sexually assaulting them. Many records estimate his total killings around 300 victims, with many killed already. Louis Garavito started his killings in 1992, targeting mostly young boys who were orphans or homeless kids. Garavito targeted such kids because no one cared if they got missing. He would convince his victims with small gifts and money. Garavito presented himself as different characters to escape suspicion, sometimes as a priest, at times an elderly man or drug dealer. In 1999, Garavito was finally caught after murdering a young boy, got arrested and pleaded innocence. He was released but later was rearrested after a homeless man saved a young boy from his hands after he had tried to rape the boy. On arrest, investigation ensured he admitted to the murders and was charged with 172 counts of homicide. Garavito was found guilty of 138 counts. Subsequently, he was sentenced for 1,853 years in prison. Garavito's sentence was reduced to 22 years as a result of him cooperating with the police in identifying the bodies of his victims. He remains in prison to this day, and the location not made known to the public. Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez is one of the worst recorded serial killers in history, nicknamed Monster of the Andes. Records say the number of people he murdered would be enough to form a small village. During the 70s, Pedro Alonso murdered over 100 tribal women in Peru. He was arrested and was about to be executed by the locals when an American missionary advised the locals to take him to the police. Subsequently, he was arrested by the police and proceeded to Ecuador, where he murdered more women. Pedro Alonso Lopez murdered at least 3 to 4 women a week while in Ecuador. He continued to murder women until he was caught in 1980. The police at the time wasn't sure he was guilty. A flood washed off the grave surface where he had buried his victims, which led to his arrest. In 1998, he was released by the Ecuador government, deporting him to his native Colombia. Lopez was charged with 110 murders, but pleaded guilty for the murder of 57 girls. Lopez received a 16-year sentence, but served just 14 years, with him being released earlier for good behavior. Pedro Alonso's whereabouts remain unknown to this day. After being linked to a murder case in 2002, he disappeared. Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas was a notorious serial killer who murdered hundreds of people in the 1960s and 70s. Born on August 23, 1936 in Blacksburg, Virginia, alongside his companion Otis Toole, they traveled and murdered anyone who crossed their path. In the year 1950, Lucas killed his mother after suffering abuses at her hands during his childhood. He was sentenced and served 10 years in prison. Alongside his travel companion, their victims were majorly hitchhikers, prostitutes. Both men would convince their victims, who would follow them, to a quiet area. The victims are then raped, killed, and sexually assaulted, with their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Sometimes they eat the body parts of their victims. Lucas had a relationship with Otis's young niece Becky Powell, which didn't go well with his partner. Otis murdered more people as a result of anger after learning of the relationship. Meanwhile, Lucas murdered Becky Powell after a slight argument. It was around this period in 1983 when he was arrested in Texas. He was arrested for the possession of a deadly weapon, but confessed to the other crimes he had committed. Officially, he was linked to just 3 murders, but many accounts believe him to be responsible for 213 murder cases. Henry Lee Lucas was sentenced to death, but the then Texas governor, George W. Bush, commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. In 2001, Henry Lucas Lee died of natural causes at age of 64. Gary Ridgeway. Known as the Green River Killer due to the fact he disposed of his victims' bodies in the Green River in Washington, one of the deadliest convicted serial killers of all time. He murdered numerous women during the 80s, targeting mostly prostitutes. According to him, he murdered at least 80 women but pleaded guilty to only 48 murders. Between 1982 and 1984, Gary murdered at least 40 women, raping, sexually assaulting, and disposing of their remains into the Green River. Ridgeway was arrested in 2001 after a breakthrough in DNA evidence linking him to the victims. At the time of his arrest, he confessed to the murders, stating he took killing women as a career. Ridgeway was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole. There have been serial killers, but these 10 serial killers stood out among the rest.